MZTV.
If I could have been a fly on the wall at any apostolic event, I would choose to be on the wall as a fly of the building where Paul withstood Peter to his face. This building was in Antioch. It's a major event of Paul. It's a major account of Paul defending the gospel of grace. Only because of that is it a major event. It was an ordinary event. There was a gathering of some kind. I think it was probably a wedding. And I'm going to read the account from the scriptures. Of course, I think you remember it. Peter was sitting with some members of the nations, and they were feeling all good about themselves. Peter accepts us. The chief of the apostles accepts us. And then some from James came in. Some of the circumcision guys from Jerusalem came in. And then what did Peter do? He switched seats. He left the nations and went and kowtowed to the Jerusalem contingent. Paul saw it happening, and he stood up and he rebuked Peter publicly to his face because of what that little action would have done to those members of the nations who would have thought, oh, okay, yeah, we figure we're not really accepted after all. Peter really doesn't think we're legit. So what I did, I want to do something different for the next couple days. In Volume 5, Issue 52 of the ZWTF newsletter. ZWTF, by the way, stands for zapping you whenever thoughts flow. Of course, I use that WTF as a trap for people who think I'm saying something else with WTF. A little joke of mine. Anyway, this was back in December of 2016. In fact, December 25th, 2016, I wrote this newsletter. And I wrote it as Paul. This is historical fiction, what I'm about to read to you. Paul, I am writing as Paul. I like to get in the man's head. And I so wanted to be there to see what was going on, to see how it went down. But I wasn't there. But the next best thing is pretending I was there. And even better than that, pretending I was there as one of the main characters, namely Paul. Now, ideally, I would hand this article off. In fact, I talked to Rodney Paris about this, handing this off to him and having him put some illustrations to this, some video, and he would do a great job of it. But I'm just feeling to get this out now. I want to do this, and I'm just going to try to do it myself. Put some illustrations here. I think this is a worthy spiritual enterprise because it's very instructive. This whole account is so instructive, and I'm going to give it flesh for you. Again, this is historical fiction. I'm not claiming that the specifics I get into are scriptural. I'm just saying that it's plausible. And wouldn't it be cool if we had a private letter from Paul giving us the nuts and bolts of what exactly happened? Well, we do have that letter from Paul in Volume 5, Issue 52 of the ZWTF newsletter. Withstanding Peter to his face, by Paul of Tarsus. But first, here's the verse. Now when Cephas came to Antioch, this is Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. Now when Cephas, that is Peter, came to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, for he was self-censured. For before the coming of some from James, he ate together with those of the nations. Yet when they came, he shrank back and severed himself, fearing those of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that Barnabas also was led away with their hypocrisy. But when I perceived that they are not correct, in their attitude toward the truth of the evangel, I said to Cephas in front of all, if you, being inherently a Jew, are living as the nations and not as the Jews, how are you compelling the nations to be Judaizing? Again, Galatians 2, verses 11 through 14. Now, let's go there and let's hear it firsthand from Paul himself. Martin Zender has bailed out on us in this, the last week of the so-called year, and the so-called celebrations belonging to it. But I will be the first one to say, yes, why not give the man a pause? My name, by the way, Paul, means pause. For I am the pause in God's plans for Israel. This suits me well because I am rather in the mood to write instead of fuss over any of your celebratory happenings. Don't take that personally. Zender filled me in on where he left off and upon what. I'm glad of it, for this topic hits my disposition just right at the moment and, ideally, in every moment. I shall make clear my meaning to you as we progress. You say that God changed me. I hear it all the time, but he really did not. You are shocked, so I must quickly explain. He changed my steering mechanism. He yanked the reins of my horse, you might say, to send me in a completely new direction. This would include the reins of my mind, the horse of my thinking, for I suddenly became the lover of the one I had spurned and rejected so hard and fast. So in this, my Lord changed me. I agree with you all day and all night upon that slant. But in other essential ways, I am not changed at all. I was and am the same man that I have always been. I looked down at my hands when first I could see again in Damascus, with gratitude to you, Ananias, and I noticed that they were the same hands that I had when I left Jerusalem. I saw the scar on the back of my right hand that I obtained as a child while playing with my father's knife. I looked at my feet. They were the same ground treaders, ugly as ever, with no nail on the small toe of my left foot. I touched my face, and there was my beard, my ears, the tip of my nose with its familiar and cursed hook, everything. I spoke to Ananias, who cared for me in Damascus, as you probably know, and my voice sounded as it always did. What did I expect? With so dramatic a turnaround, I half expected that I would speak and that upon utterance light would emerge, or that the voice of an angel, whatever that sounds like, would issue to level my host to the ground, literally, so that I would have to retrieve him and apologize for the outburst. You may find all of this curious, but I tested everything, much as a man who falls off of a horse tests all of his bones to see if they're intact. Then the man who has been dehorsed tries to think a thought to see if he can still think. I did all of this, though I was not on a horse when it happened. It was right after lunch, before I mounted, while we were yet gathering our things, so I speak hypothetically, and was surprised to discover that I was the same man that had left Jerusalem on my insane mission. How could everything be so different, I wondered, and yet everything so the same? And so I performed all of those tests, as I said, and they all came back positive. I was still Saul, born in Tarsus, still the tribe of Benjamin, and at the same time still called Pharisee, yet no longer one in heart. That much I knew. So there I sat at the kitchen table of the great saint. That Saint Ananias stared at me as though he were watching a play. I recalled for him my parents, my brothers, my sisters, my schooling. It was all still there. It entertained me to see Ananias so puzzled, watching me continue like this, for I was not talking to him formally, but confirming realities to myself out loud, corroborating my essence. I remembered precisely the morning I left Jerusalem, the men I took, the lunch we ate just before noon of the fateful day, figs and lamb chops, and the light that blinded me that I shall never forget, that knocked me off my feet. But then, something very odd happened. Ananias said that we ought to celebrate with a little wine. A lover of the product of fermented grapes myself, I put up no argument. God had not taken this from me either. Ananias had very much of the stuff, several skins from Rome, some from Seleucia, and a few of the new bottlings from Damascus, of course, as they are known there for their dry reds and remarkable packaging. So he hands me a cup. I'm most appreciative for it, but as I sip it, I note that it is sweeter than a dry ought to be, with a strange hint of cherry. But I speak now of cherries that have been rotted on the tree. I took one sip of it. Ananias waited expectantly, and I said, God, are you sure that this has not been drawn from the latrine? I could have bit my tongue as soon as I said it, but instead I started to laugh. Soon I was laughing so hard that the wine, or whatever it was, I was either bold or stupid enough to take another slug of it, spilled out over my mouth and onto my shirt. Ananias was taken aback at first, rather insulted, no doubt, but then began laughing with me, not even knowing why. He surely did not know why I was succumbing to the mirth, but I will tell you just why. It was so me to say what I did to that saint. It is the classic contradiction of my personality, the sweet and the bitter from the same well. A thing that made James always say to the others, quote, "This man is the antithesis of everything we hope and dream for." It was the so-called old soul. I was troubled, you see. It is just that I've been known for speaking my mind. I sometimes even speak before I think, relying on my instinct and the history of all my opinions to inform me. And this they do, sometimes without me. The surprising surprise of it all was that all of this remained intact even after what you have come to know as my Damascus conversion. I do not countenance anything in humanity, really, that is second-rate. Even those bound in sin must excel, is what I think. Excel in your poverty, in spite of all. I do not countenance laziness. I am the hardest on myself. Just ask Barnabas. Come to think of it, I would rather that you not ask him. My quick opinions oftentimes seem harsh, and I oftentimes apologize for them, as I did this day with the wine and my good host. When the outburst had run its course and the wine had run its course down my chin, I said to Ananias, "What I meant to say, my dear friend, is that perhaps you can find another skin among your collection that has not been presented on the label as that which it most certainly is not." I have often said privately that it is sometimes better to offend and apologize than never to offend at all. The apology brings to the fore the heart, which may lay unknown before the opportunity provided by God for its display. This has served me well before and after Damascus. All of this to explain to you my hard sayings and my hard advice to workers such as Timothy: expose, rebuke, and treat with all patience. And that time in Antioch, when I withstood the great apostle Peter, otherwise known as Cephas, to his face. I have never regretted what I did in Antioch at the now noted wedding feast, but so much criticism befell me for it afterwards, exclusively from the Jews, that I asked the Lord 3 times for whatever it was inside of me that made me like this, to depart from me. I asked Christ to remove it and added, if it must be removed, and if it was meant to be gone from me, then do it. Enter soft flute music here. I prayed half-heartedly. I tell you this now, for the truth is that I felt comfortable with the thing, and it was only the opinion of others that made me doubt. But Christ has since taught me to never decide things based on the opinions of others. I thought that maybe the thing was to be, in its various manifestations, forevermore a hindrance to the work. This I dreaded. I thought that perhaps the person who I was deep down would cause others to trip, so that they would also falter over the evangel itself due to my quirk of being, and reject it out of hand. I had been scolded by an elder of the Antioch ecclesia. He had done it nicely, but had no respect for my office. I thought then, this man is not looking at things rightly. But I still laid myself down in front of it and in front of him, wondering if perhaps God were speaking to me through this man. I am never too high to learn. So this man berated me because, after all, it was Peter who I had rebuked so soundly and publicly. I can tell you now that this elder was and is a respecter of persons. I do not say this to compliment him. Peter is a man like the rest of us, although I myself have felt the intimidation of the Rock. My critic was not influential at all. There's no need to mention his name. His chief argument was, why do it publicly? My first thought was, good question. But the thought following soon after was that it would amount to nothing had it not been public. For the thing was done not for the benefit of Peter foremost, but for the benefit of the Greek believers present, whose faith would falter and was faltering at the hypocrisy of the Lord's great disciple. What happened in Antioch on the evening of Simeon's wedding feast is a simple story, really, and yet complicated as can be. It was even more dramatic than how you read of it today in the famous collection, for I held back my account then when writing to the Galatians so many years ago. But now that I am writing for Martin Zender, I shall not hold back. For the restraints holding me then are withdrawn today, and it is my delight now to give full vent to the details. No small thing. I know that this is what Zender does and would want, so I feel comfortable in this environment and thankful for it. It was the wedding feast of Peter's nephew, Simeon. Peter came up for it, as did many of the circumcision believers. They all liked to drink, yes, and Antioch was famous for such enterprises. Besides that, everyone liked Simeon and his betrothed, Abigail, who served as secretary for the Jerusalem ecclesia. Barnabas and I were already there, as was Luke. My contingent was in Antioch to work, but we were happy for the time away from it, and of course to see Simeon again. As a way of preface, the true explanation of what happened that evening may be found in the character of Cephas. He was gregarious and off the cuff, but this was also the man's occasional downfall. Off the cuff may be expressed negatively as impulsive. The sandal fits. Peter cares deeply what others think of him, more so than do I, even in my worst moments. I should not bring this up, but I think my account demands it. Consider his denial of our Lord, the night of Jesus' betrayal. But now when it comes to walking on water, who better to call out onto the sea than Peter? He was the only one impulsive enough to try it. But of course, once he does a thing that is so bold, he soon doubts everything. We all know the result of that. This does not lessen my love for the man, but only increases it. He is the most human, I would say, of all the Jerusalem contingent. I do not mean to suggest that the rest are so much pottery, but that compared to Peter, they are businessmen. They're a gaggle of pragmatists. You must know what a celebrity that Peter was then. Wherever he went, people followed him. They followed him to touch him, to have him speak a word to them, to have him write his name on various possessions, even on their arms. Some would have him leave a mark upon their foreheads. I had witnessed that. He could not escape celebrity, this man, anywhere in Jerusalem. The saints there especially, where there were thousands of believers, harried him in the markets, at the library, in the park, everywhere. Peter said to me once, I could wish for anonymity again. But it was too late for him, especially in those places where Christ was most enthusiastically named. Here in Antioch, Christ was being so named, and you can thank Barnabas, Luke, and me for that, for the Lord had prospered us there. They knew well of Peter, for we had told them of the great fisher of men, even in the synagogues. I had never been with the Lord while he walked the earth, but Peter had. For here was his right-hand man, and for that I admit, I even was most anxious to touch him when first we met. My awe of him was profound. But then, of course, I got to know him, and then he was good old Cephas. Several months earlier, we had convened and almost just as quickly had successfully concluded the now famous Jerusalem Council, where it was decided that no burdens such as circumcision should be laid upon any of the converts to my message. It lasted 20 minutes, that meeting. This was the highlight. No further burdens. All but a few burdens in reality. They had to prohibit something to save national face. Peter liked it and acceded enthusiastically to it. The others agreed, but somewhat begrudgingly. I knew this. I cared little for the secret misgivings so long as the decrees went forth with the signatures. It's what the decrees did not say that was important. It was a resounding victory for my message. Not a full victory as far as the decrees went. They would later be revoked, but good enough at the time. It was good enough to bring freedom, acceptance, and legitimacy to the minds of the converts to my message. Many in Jerusalem held the decrees of Gentile freedom to be theoretical. This I knew. They simply could not picture it in practice. By it, I mean treating Gentiles as anything but second-class citizens, second-class worshipers of Christ, dogs. I tell you, you must not ever underestimate the emotional power of national pride and racial ties. Luke and Barnabas and I arrived before Peter, Andrew, and John. I have not told you, and it is not in the official account, that Andrew and John attended the feast. They witnessed the whole of what I am about to describe to you. No one has known that until now. You are the first. Andrew was Peter's brother. John came because of Simeon, the groom. Simeon was a near disciple of Christ from the time of Cana. He actually attended that wedding. He was not of the 12, but Peter called him 13. That was his nickname for him. 2 hours after the crucifixion, Simeon cut himself to take his own life. John found him behind the home of Miriam in a pool of blood. The darkness was still about the land. Luke saved his life. From the resurrection on, Simeon and John became co-laborers in the work. It would not be incorrect to say that Peter's nephew became John's closest friend. It was not an easy thing getting close to John. As an aside, I could not speak easily with John. I knew who I was. John barely knew who I was, but his disposition unnerved even me. I could never find my footing around the man. I did not say this to his detriment, but to mine. The man moved with a heaviness. I'm tempted to call it a darkness, though it was certainly not that. A heaviness and a solitude that hung from him like the beam of wood used to crucify his Savior. He carried weight, but it never bent him. His gaze withered me. He would not move his eyes. His hair was black, and so were his eyes. John moved silently through our world. He moved like a monk, even with Christ. Peter has told me of it. John brooded, especially at their last meal. He witnessed the transfiguration. Only 3 can say that. He would never talk to me of that occasion. Peter gave me everything, but not John. James would not tell me anything, but for different reasons. Our Lord gave his mother to John from the stake. Such was his fondness for the man. He was the quiet one. To grasp the hand of John, however, was to grasp the branch of an oak tree. Such a gaze and a grasp could hardly be borne, at least not by me. And I knew the best of them. And yet, when he and Simeon were alone, I heard them laughing. This was at the Jerusalem Council. I asked Simeon about it later. So singular was the sound of the laughter from a man such as John. But all Simeon would tell me was that John relayed to him a dream he'd had about horses and an emerald rainbow. It was a foretaste of what was to come, we now know. But what humor there was in it at that early time, 40 years before the revelation, I cannot say. I was not made privy to it. I shall ask John the next time I see him at the consummation of those things. Many of the converts from the nations sat with me at my table and 4 adjoining. In the vast wooden room were 13 tables, 5 chairs to a place. Peter sat at a table to my right. Barnabas and Luke sat ahead of that. I had walked in with Peter, aware of his every step. I strained to stay 1 step behind him, to follow his lead. I wished to see what he did. This was more than a wedding party. It was a mix of Jews and Greeks in century 1. This was the genesis of everything to do with these Gospels, the 2, and those who would believe them. To us, then, it was all on the brink. You take it all for granted, but nothing was for granted then. We could blow it all up, or so we thought. We were human and could make mistakes. It was a test of Peter, really. That's how I saw it. He could lovingly embrace them or shun them. I knew that he had not shunned them in theory, but what about in practice? This was not Cornelius. This was not one proselyte with Peter surrounded by his posse. Cornelius, at least, had to come through Israel. Peter had to be called for. That was historic. Cornelius was filled with the Spirit before baptism, but this was more so. Here, the mediation of Israel was completely dispensed with. It sat well with so few of the mother ecclesia. Something great had happened, and now God had visited the nations with my pen and my voice. God more than visited them. He gave them an expectation far beyond Israel's, and, as I said, apart from Israel. Not even Peter grasped that the calling of the nations sat above his. I had told him, but he could not receive it. I saw him look away the day I explained it to him. I saw him not receive it. I saw him tacitly deny it. It was enough for him then to accept the theory. To mingle with Greeks wholesale was outside the perimeter of Peter's adventure. This was in Jerusalem when I told him. We sat near a window at his house. A larger contingent of the circumcision would come to the Orion Hall. We were early. A contingent was coming up from Jerusalem. How I wanted to press Peter beforehand, impress him really, about the importance of his role. But I overmanaged things by nature. I did not want to do that here. Oh, but I did. I wanted to tell him exactly what to do, where to walk, whom to greet first, how to talk, what to say. I knew how against his religion every aspect of this was, but I also knew of the vision in Joppa. Something stopped me. I did not want this to be the religion of Paul. The religion of Paul must not be the religion of Peter. I would not force the future or the solution upon the great man. It must be as an olive flower budding on the tree at its own pace. It must come to Peter organically. I prayed for it continually, even as we sipped whiskeys at Toltaville's the hour before. Everything helps, yes? He followed on my coattails. What a turning of the tables that was. But this, for a change, was my world, and he a visitor in it. He may as well have been on the moon, my Cephas. I went to the table of the Greeks, the one nearest the meats, and here he came with me, full behind me. They all stood, the Greeks. Like me, at first, they all wanted to touch him, but they dared not. None of them did, at first, but they could not take their eyes from him. To be continued.